All right. Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar. We'll be talking about best practices for setup, templating, and widget creation within Sitefinity. My name is Chris Woodard and I'm a technical consultant and sales engineer for Telerik. I've been with them for about a year and a half, and before that I worked for one of their partners for about 5.5 years, where I led a team of developers working on mostly Sitefinity site builds and some custom implementations. Okay, so for today's discussion, I've prepared a project. It's got some templates and some widgets in it, just so that we can actually support the discussion, but it is nowhere near complete. It's just got enough that we can actually talk about. Okay, so let's actually switch to Visual Studio and jump right in. Okay, and actually, here is that project that I've set up. So this has just got a responsive template. I basically downloaded a theme from Theme Forest and implemented the code within my project here. Just a quick solution. Okay. So in Visual Studio, we have our Sitefinity web app and our webinar.sitefinity. This one is actually just going to be an external project I created to host some custom code. Okay. The very first step that I take when I start a project is I will actually come into the Sitefinity web app and I will switch the .NET framework from being 4 to being 4.5. The benefit of this is you get access to all the .NET 4.5 classes and updated code when you're using C#. Also, it'll save you some issues down the road if you actually create your own external projects, or when you install the NuGet packages, it'll actually avoid some conflicts. One of those conflicts, if I were to actually add a new project here, because I have .NET 4.5 installed on my machine, Visual Studio is going to create that new project in .NET 4.5, and then if I were to add that as a reference to a Sitefinity 4.0 build, it would actually give me a conflict because I'm trying to add a .NET 4.5 project to a project that's got .NET 4. Okay, so I would actually have to switch this to being .NET 4.5 so that I can use that new project, or switch all of my external projects to also being .NET 4. Okay. The second step that I typically take is installing the NuGet packages. So Sitefinity essentially has NuGet packages for all of the references that you see in the project. Okay, by default, Sitefinity comes built to where all of these references are tied directly to the bin folder. So if you click on the build or the rebuild or clean button, you're going to run into some issues because that's going to clear out your bin folder where those references are actually tied to. Okay, the NuGet packages solves that issue. And to install those, we've actually got a guide. If you come into nuget.sitefinity.com, this essentially shows you how to set up the Sitefinity NuGet repository. We do not have these on the default NuGet repository. You'll have to set up a Sitefinity one, and that'll give you access to all of our builds. We also release our internal builds there. So if you're upgrading your project to an internal build, this makes that process much easier because you can just simply use the NuGet command line to upgrade your project to an internal build. Okay. So once you go through these steps, you'll actually be able to see the new repository within the Package Manager console and NuGet. So let's go and open that. To access that, you can actually go Tools, NuGet Package Manager, Package Manager console. You may need to install this extension if you don't already have it. Okay. This will open this window down here. And if you've set everything correctly, you will have a new repo here for Sitefinity NuGet. And then you select the project that you want this installed to. By default, I always do the Sitefinity web app project. And even for my additional projects, I won't install my references directly to there. I'll actually add references pointing to the packages folder for NuGet. Okay. So once you have this installed, you're going to run this command. It's install package telerik.sitefinity.all version, and this is going to be your Sitefinity version. This part's really important because if you have a version that is not the latest internal build, it will automatically install whatever the latest version is on that NuGet repository. So this could be an internal build for 8.0, for example, and maybe you're on 7.3. Okay, so you would need to specifically mention that you're looking for that version. In my case, I'm using 8.0.5701. Okay, So I would add that in there, and that's going to fetch the NuGet references for that specific version. Again, running this command will take a little bit of time because it's got to go and download those, and it's going to add those references. All right. And this is important. I would always run this command after you set your .NET framework to .NET 4.5, because if you decide to switch that framework version later and then you do the NuGet packages, they're actually going to be pointing to the old version, so you have to re-grab those again. So switch the .NET framework version first, then do your NuGet package download. Okay. This is going to give you this packages.config file. It's going to add some targets here as well, and this contains all the references to those actual versions. All right. After you have that, those references will be added. You can do a build, and you're good to roll. So let's do a little bit of overview just from the project perspective of what you would actually check into source control. And part of that is actually going to be what you're going to also include in the project. Okay? By default, you're probably going to see something very similar to this. You'll have your assembly info, references, app data, backup folder. This is just created from Visual Studio. Don't need to worry about that. I typically do not check in the bin folder. Now, I've actually seen projects where they do this and they check in the references, but if you're using NuGet, you don't need to do that. NuGet will automatically have that packages.config, and that will get checked in. And then what you can do, so if you have this in source control and the developer pulls it down, they won't have any references or a bin folder by default, but they can come into the solution and enable NuGet package restore. And then on your first build, it's going to pull all those references down from the packages config and add them to your project. So bin folder is not needed in source control. Okay, these ones are automatically included in the project and you're fine with those. Resource packages, I would include this one in the project so you have it with it. So let's go ahead and include that one. Okay, and I would do the same thing with the tools just to be safe. Let's include that in the project as well. Okay, these zip files, these are just for upgrading from Sitefinity 3.7. So if you're starting a new project, you don't really need those to be within the project itself. Okay. App data. So let's go ahead and talk about this. This is where most of the questions come around source control. So by default, a lot of this will actually be excluded. I would include the app data folder in the project. Configuration, I always recommend including these in source control, so that way you can actually have versioning on them. In a little bit, in just a sec here, we'll actually be talking about the best way to manage these config files when you're working with multiple developers. So we'll hold off on that in just a second, but I would include these into the project. Global resources, I would include this as well. So this actually contains some resources for the newsletters. Layout templates is a custom folder I created just to source some of the templates for layout controls I have, so those are included. The log files, these are going to contain all the error logs and trace logs, or if you're also using SiteSync, those logs will go there as well. I typically don't have these in source control. I just keep them in, on the actual environment where we're hosting it, and then I'll make sure that we have backups of those as well. So you can leave that one out of source control. You can leave temp out of source control, and you can leave Thunder out of source control. Okay. The Sitefinity license file, this is going to be the license that's actually used to power the site. If you don't have that in there, you'll get that trial message, and eventually you actually may get the message that say you can't use it anymore. So I always recommend keeping that in the project. That way you can actually run it. When a developer pulls it down, they don't have to go fetch that themselves manually. Storage. If you're using file storage for your libraries in Sitefinity, you're going to want this included in the project. If you are just using database storage, which is the default, then this isn't going to be too important. But just to keep things safe, let's go ahead and include that in the project as well. Okay. Website templates. My recommendation, include the whole thing. So all of your CSS, all of your images, all your JavaScript, keep those all within the project and source controlled. All right. So let's go and hop back to talking a little bit about the configuration files here. So when you're working with multiple developers, there can be some issues with the config files. Essentially, if one developer is creating a module, for example, that module will write to a config file. And until that gets checked in, let's also assume that these developers are connected in the same database. That's a pretty typical setup. So they got the same database, but they have separate code solutions. And one person creates a module, modifies the config file, and the other developers are out of sync until they check that in. So they may get an error because they have a database which has a table and information for a module, but they don't have config files for it. The most obvious solution is to just ask that developer to check it in. So if you're just sitting near other developers at a very close range environment, that's probably the easiest solution for this. You don't need to go through any hoops to make sure you're all in sync. Just ping the other person, ask them to check their stuff in. Okay. Obviously, having source control around these, very helpful. Another option, and this kind of takes source control out of play here a little bit if you go this option, but you can move these config files into the database. So essentially, everyone's tied to the same database. Everyone would then be tied to the same configuration. We do have a documentation article out there on how to do that, and that will take these files here will still stay there because they are the default values. Any changes made to the config files then after will be stored in the database, and everyone will have those in sync. That's the most ideal solution for keeping them in sync. Now, if you have a lot of developers like having access to the config files directly, and if they're in the database, you either have to go into the backend of Sitefinity and manage them in the settings, or you've got to use SQL essentially to get to those. So if you can manage, sometimes it's easier for developers to actually keep them in the solution here. And there's a third option. So the first option is just keep them source controlled and use communication between the developers to keep those in sync. Second option is move them to the database. Third option is this also, I believe, takes source control out of the mix. You could configure it to keep it. But essentially, you would go into IIS and you would have this configuration folder point to a virtual directory on the network. So what that does is there's one configuration folder with all the config files sitting out on the network somewhere that all these developers have access to. Okay? And then when Sitefinity is trying to access that configuration folder, IIS is going to point them to that virtual directory. So everyone's going to be using the same grouping of config files. And that is actually a process which one of the developers in our community put out there. And I will post this link up in the chat afterwards, just so you guys have that resource. Okay. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the actual setup of the project that we have here. So I've used Sitefinity Thunder to create a theme and a master page. Okay, so I've got one default.master, and I've got a default theme here as well. If you have Sitefinity Thunder installed, it will actually help you with this process, and I definitely recommend using Sitefinity Thunder for this part. I'll explain why. If I were to come in here and just create my own folder for the website template, create my own theme, it would still work. I would have to manually come into the appearance configuration and register my theme. Thunder would do that for me automatically, which is a great benefit. The other thing that Thunder does for me here, as you'll notice, I have this layout.css, which if we open that, this is a lot of default styling that Sitefinity provides. You can see there's a lot of stuff here. With that, it makes it a little easier to actually go in and start doing your CSS customizations because you have something to start with. If you prefer to start from the ground up and don't have any of the base styles in there, then you can obviously do without that. But me, I like to actually have default styles in there that I can work from. And when you create a project or a template using Thunder, it's going to contain this layout.css here for you automatically. And you're going to have all that default CSS that you can work from. Also, you'll have a lot of default images that Sitefinity will install for you. Okay, so none of these are my images. These are all Sitefinity images that Thunder created. All right, and it also creates that CSS load order for us by default. And if everyone's familiar with this file, this is how you actually set up the order that the CSS files get loaded onto the page in. And obviously I've selected the Sitefinity CSS to load first. That way I can override it with my CSS. So takeaway here, use Thunder to actually create your themes. You can do that by right-clicking on Sitefinity, go and add, new item. Okay, and if you have Thunder installed, you'll have these templates here on the left for Sitefinity, and you have all these templates here that you can use for actual code templates. The one we would be using would either be theme or website template. So if you just wanted to create a theme for an existing template, you would select Sitefinity theme. And if you wanted to create a template, which would also create a theme for you by default, you could create the template here, and that would create another folder at the level of default. Okay, so whenever you're creating a new template or theme for Sitefinity, use Thunder. It's going to give you some default stuff there that you can work from. So let's talk about our site here. Let's jump back to Chrome. So you can see this is a web forms project. I'm not using Project Feather, and I'm actually not using a responsive module in this one just yet. So right now what I've done is I've created my header and my footer, and I've done this in my master page. And you can see I've set up my responsive manually for these. If I come into my master page, what I do is I set up specific placeholders just for the areas in my header. So another method that I've seen people use here is they'll actually have layouts for their header, and then they'll configure their columns within layouts, which is an option, but a lot of times the people actually making the changes to those templates are going to be the developers anyways. So my recommendation ultimately is for your base template, keep your header and your footer and all the structure set up for those done in your master page, and then just for the middle section where all the content's going to go, so your left sidebar and your right content area, have that be one content placeholder, and that will be controlled with layouts. And even more so, you could then control those with responsive design, and that's where people are going to get the most benefit out of it. Okay, let's actually take a look at this in the back end just so we can see what it looks like. Okay, so I've just set up two templates here just for an example, and I have inheritance working for me. So I've got this base template, and this is pointing to my master page. So from a setup perspective, and I've seen this a lot, I've seen situations where there will be one master page, but they'll have 5 templates, and every template is configured manually pointing to the master page. I've also seen situations where there will be multiple master pages for each template, so 2-column left sidebar would actually be its own master page. If you can manage it, and typically if you have a header and a footer that's going to stay the same on every page, then you'll keep one base master page, one base template, and then your structural templates will inherit from your base. So you can see I have my default master, base templates inheriting on the 2-column. So let's click into this base template here. This is where you're going to configure all of your global elements. So my navigation, my logo, all the stuff in my footer, I'm putting these all into the base template. The benefit of that is if I'm modifying the 2-column left sidebar template, none of the other stuff's there. So I don't have the ability to accidentally break the template because I don't have access to any of these widgets here. So I've configured my content block, my navigation, language selector, logo, navigation, and then everything in the footer here as well within this base template itself. And then the page layout, which is where the layout for the actual page is created, I just left open, and it's full width, okay? And I'm going to configure that on the specific templates that inherit from this one. Okay, and I also just set my theme from here as well. And if you were to click to the Layout tab, you'll notice I'm not using any layouts for any of this. I configured all this directly in my master page, and then I'm going to use layouts for the meat of the page where the content's going. Let's jump back. Let's take a look at our 2-column left sidebar. Okay, so now we have a sidebar and a page content area. And in this project, I am using a responsive framework, so I'm not using the responsive module. The same concept will apply here, though. You could easily use the responsive module for this layout and control that with all the rules that you've set up. In this circumstance, I've actually just added my CSS to the template here for my responsive framework that I'm using. This one's using Foundation. Okay, so I define my row, my columns, and the sizing here. And you'll notice that all of these widgets in the header and footer are not accessible. The only thing that I can configure is the page layout for this specific area here. So if I were to come to a page, and we'll jump into this About page, which is a sample page that I've set up. I'm reading through some of the questions here. And feel free to post questions. I will try to answer as many as I can if I get some areas to pause during the session. If not, if we have time at the end, I'll answer them. And worst case scenario, I'll follow up with a blog post to respond to those questions. Okay, just depends on how many we get. Okay, so this is our About page, which is inheriting from our 2-column left sidebar. So I've got my 2 content sections that I've set up. Everything obviously is already configured for the header and footer here. And now I can just start to drag my widgets onto the page. The benefit of this setup is now if I want to change the header footer, I can do it here in the master page. If I want to change the content in the header footer, then I would do it on the page template in Sitefinity. And then all of my pages and all of my templates inheriting from that base master page are automatically going to get updated. So this is that recommended structure. Another little tip. I'm not sure if I got this far here. So you notice I have a content block here, and I don't know how many of you actually jump into your page template section to make those changes, or if you just have your developer get into your templates. Because it can be somewhat dangerous if things aren't configured very well, that maybe you place something in a different area and you make a change and you didn't want to publish that. What you can do is I recommend actually coming into these content blocks here. So the text here for copyright, text here for the content block for my footer links, these sections here are content blocks as well. You can actually make these shared. So you can come and edit here and actually share this content. And that's going to make it accessible from content blocks. So then your end user, whoever that may be, doesn't have to go into the template to change that content. They can just come into the content blocks and manage it there. So that gives you some ability to keep them out of the templates if you want to make sure that no changes get made that shouldn't be made. And again, that's a very easy process to do. Okay. So let's talk about that About page we created a little bit. Okay. Okay. So I've set up a page. I've got a couple sample widgets which we'll talk through. This is just using that template we created. I've added a couple widgets here, which is what we're going to discuss. So I've seen a lot of situations where a lot of extra work is being put in to create these widgets where they aren't always necessary. And let's talk about that. So About, and I've actually set up an example here. So we have a widget here. We've got some text on the left side. We've got a button, and that button right now is taking us to the home page. So essentially, we have a situation where we need to allow them to create a button, manage the text for the button, manage the link for that button, and then manage the text on the left side. So if we click on Edit, we've got our HTML editor, we've got our button link, we've got our browser website. Obviously, Thunder made it a little easier because I could just use the Thunder Designer tool to actually create this designer. But it's still a lot of extra code, and it's a lot of extra work than what we really need. We just have a button, and we just have a WYSIWYG on the left here. So let me show you an option that you can actually use that's a little quicker. So instead of using custom widgets, you can use custom layouts. So if we actually click on the Layout tab here, you'll notice that I have a layout called Call to Action. And I've created a custom section over here. So this layout just creates the HTML structure for essentially what this widget is going to be. So I've got my left side, my right side, and I've already got my CSS all pre-populated within the layout template itself. So now as the end user, all I have to do is drag on a call to action area, and then I drag in my content to each section. And now CSS takes over for everything. Okay. So let's take a look at that layout real quick. Okay, so here's that call to action layout. You can see that we've got our responsive CSS that we've added here to our page. And we've added our info box class. This is essentially what controls the styling. And we got a question about which version Sitefinity has for the custom layouts. That's been there for quite a long time. The ability to actually support those custom layouts can be registered within your toolbox's config. Okay, so within that, you're going to have a page layout section, and this is the toolbox that gets loaded for layouts. Then you can create your own custom section, which is what I've done here, and then I've got 2 custom layouts that I've created. And this points to just a location in your project. So I've got the call to action. And again, I'm not sure which specific version. I know that's been there for at least 2 whole versions. So that's been there since 6 for sure. Okay. And then this text and button is the ability to actually specify a label. So if we come back to our back end here and delete this content block, that's what gives me this text and gives me button here. Okay. So again, this is just some HTML. I added that widget, registered in the toolbox. It's drag and drop a lot quicker than creating the custom widget. For the custom widget, I've got 3 files for designer, JavaScript, my C# code, my front end for the widget, or for the designer, and then my front end for the widget here, and the actual C# code for the widget itself. So I've got almost 5 code files here compared to just the 1 code file if I was using a custom layout. Okay. And just to reinforce that, I did that with another area here. This section down here, which just adds the blue line, changes the formatting of the text. Instead of doing any kind of custom widget for that, I created another custom layout, called it block quote. Now they can drag that on and add their content into that area. To identify the areas where you can actually use custom layouts, always ask your question is, can you do this with just CSS? Because if you can do it with just CSS, as far as most of it just being styling around content, more than likely you can do this with just a custom layout and not having to create a whole widget for it. Okay. Let's talk about some of the view map stuff. So we're going to go into some other widgets in Sitefinity. And actually, I'm going to leave that for later. Let's talk about widget templates. Okay, just briefly, let's come into the widget template section. So these are your templates for actually changing the HTML structure for a specific widget in Sitefinity. So for example, you might have a news widget on the page, and that news view will have a list template, a single template for the actual full view, and you have a couple options even for list. And that would give you the ability to customize just the list view of the news widget. That's essentially what a widget template is. So if we come down and look for news, you can see we have about 4 different templates for lists that we can choose from. We'll go ahead and look at the title states and summaries. So here's my recommendation on these. A lot of times I'm seeing people actually come into these templates and they're modifying them directly. So for their titles, dates, and summaries, they'll make some changes directly to these to support their design file that they were given, which is fine. The only problem with that is the nice thing about these templates is they show you how to do things in Sitefinity. So this shows me how to create that details view hyperlink for the title field. It shows me how to list out the publication date. You know, if I had some custom fields in here, it shows me how to do the image field. And maybe, you know, I just deleted the pager here for mine. You always want to have a backup of these so you can actually see what the original was And even more so, if Sitefinity goes through an upgrade and these widget templates get upgraded, you want to make sure that if it's something beneficial, that you upgrade your custom widget template as well. So what I recommend here is not modifying these templates directly. Leave them default. Use them as reference points. Create your own templates for your widgets, copy and paste over the code, and then customize it. Because then if Sitefinity goes through an upgrade, it'll upgrade that widget template, and you'll have all that upgraded code that you can refer to. Okay. Otherwise, you could also potentially run into a situation where it overwrites your widget template and you lose your work. Okay. So let's jump back to our page here. So for most of the widgets in Sitefinity, you're given a widget template. So we have our images widget, we have events, probably a calendar view here as well, blogs, navigation widgets. We even have one for the profile, change password view, search results. But not all of the widgets in Sitefinity have a widget template. There are a couple where it's still not accessible for you to actually modify the widget code from this area here right now. Okay, a couple of those are going to be this language selection, which I have at the top right. So this is a custom view that I've created for that. We've got the newsletter. So this newsletter widget that outputs the input and the button, these are not widget templates in Sitefinity. So if you wanted to modify these, you've got to take an extra step. And the search box widget in Sitefinity, which essentially, I don't have one on this site, but that would be your ability to actually search content. So the search box, not the search results list, because that one is a widget template down here, but the search box is not a widget template. To modify those, it's actually really easy. It's just about as easy as creating your own layout template. And what you're going to do is you use what is called the view map in Sitefinity. The view map is essentially an area in the configuration, and this allows you to plug in a class name. Okay? And then it gives you the ability to say, whenever you're pulling up this class or this widget, send the layout template request over to this file instead. Okay, so let's come back to our advanced. And this view map, I believe, lives in controls. Yes. Okay, we have view map. This will be there by default. And then I've added two here. So you can see I've got my newsletter subscription control, and I've got my language selector control here as well. Okay. And if we click into one of those, you essentially have the host type. This is going to be the full class name with the assembly. Okay. I got this from the toolbox controls config file in Sitefinity. I just looked that up to see which what was the class name. So if you ever want to see those, just jump into the toolbox's config. And for nearly all the Sitefinity widgets, you can see full class name, assembly, right here in the type. So plug that in the host type. And then your layout template path is going to be the location. You can see I've just got my virtual location here. So it's being referenced from the project root. Point that all the way down to wherever your file is. This can be wherever you want. I always recommend keeping it with your website templates just to keep everything structured. So we can see I have a widget templates folder inside of my default widget website template. So let's come take a look at that. Okay, we have widget templates right here. And then I have two widgets, language selector and newsletter sign up. So this code here is essentially what the newsletter sign up was using, and then I made some customizations to it to support what I needed. Okay. Now, to get this default code, because when you go ahead and override one of those layout templates, you're going to want to get this default code so you can modify it. You can use just decompile. Just decompile in Sitefinity. It's actually a Telerik product. It allows you to decompile the assemblies so you can actually look to see what that layout is. To get those, again, you can use that toolbox config. You can open up this class with just decompile. This one's the wishlist control, but you get the idea. And then you can actually look to see where that layout template is and open that using just decompile, get that code out, and paste it directly into your widget template here. Then you just start your customization, and the view map's going to handle everything from then on out. Okay. So it's actually three of the main ones that you'll need to use that for are going to be your language selector, your newsletter sign-up widget, and a search box. I'm sure there's other ones, but those are three of the main ones that I run into when doing site builds. Okay. And let's go ahead and talk one more piece on widget templates that I wanted to touch on. This is just something I've been seeing a lot. Let's jump into, we'll do navigation. So let's pretend we have a sidebar over here. It's navigation, and we actually have the title, Site Navigation in the left sidebar. What I'm seeing a lot lately is they will actually come in and do something like this. They'll do H4, Site Navigation, and put that heading for whatever widget it is directly in their widget template. And you can actually see I've done that here just out of laziness for menu toggle. This is actually bad. Essentially, to modify that, or if your end user wants to modify that, and keep in mind your end user probably isn't going to want to jump into these widget templates ever. To change that text, you're kind of limiting them because either you're going to have to do it or your end user is going to have to jump in here and actually modify it. The workaround, which I'm not seeing a lot of people make use of, is to use Sitefinity resource labels. So an example of this, let's see if we have one in here. Okay, it looks like the navigation widget doesn't have one. Let's take a look at comments. See if we can find a good one for this. There we go. Okay, so this is telling Sitefinity to access the resources, the orders resource class, and access the out of stock label. Okay, and instead of having out of stock right here, which is certainly acceptable, they use resources. So now, instead of actually having to go into this widget template to change that text, they can change it within the resource itself. And Sitefinity gives you access to all those resources within labels and messages. And this will allow your end user to modify that text by just coming into the specific class that contains that label. And let's just pretend that we're using this option 0 price label here. We can actually click into one of these, and we can modify it. This also inherently makes multilingual a lot easier, because resources, if you're on a specific language, you can actually specify the resource value for each language right in here as well. So instead of putting your text directly in your widget templates, use resources in Sitefinity. You can create your own resource class, and Thunder actually has a scaffolding tool for that as well. Okay, Sitefinity resource class. And this is going to give you your own class so you can actually create your resources in. Okay, and let's talk about one more thing on this page. Okay, it looks like we got a question regarding multi-site on the view maps. Can you create multiple view maps for Sitefinity multi-site? I believe right now the view map is going to be global. So your advanced settings are going to apply to essentially all the sites. There should be still a way to do this, and what I'll do is I'll take note of this request, and I will follow up on it in the blog post. Just a sec to make a note. Okay. Okay, so I've created a simple widget right here at the top listing out the users that are in this system. It's just an example widget, and I also listed out the creation date. This could be a Twitter feed. This could be a widget that's pulling from an external data source. It could be anything. This general idea that I want to get across here is if you have content that is dynamic. So let's assume I'm a user, I'm refreshing this page, and in the midst of that, a new user gets added to the system. There is a chance that you're not going to see that new user on this page because Sitefinity's caching is going to cache the contents of this widget, and it's not going to know about the new user being submitted because there's no cache and validation happening specifically in my widget. On the Sitefinity default widgets, there is. So with this, if I actually want this content to always pull live, it's never pulling from a cached version. I've seen a lot of sites where instead of doing the work to make this one widget not be cached, they will actually come into the page settings and they'll come down and they'll turn off caching altogether for the page. This isn't good. This is going to hurt your performance. So you want to keep that caching on, and you want to just implement, it's called cache substitution, on your specific widget. So let's talk about that a little bit, how that can be done. And this is going to be sample widget. So I've got a repeater, list out the username, the creation date. And what's interesting is this repeater, even though I have a layout template for this, it isn't really being used. And I'll explain why. Let's jump into our CS. So it won't be used with our cache substitution. Right now it is just for this example. So I have this initialize controls method, and this is where I am pulling back a list of users from the system, and I'm binding my repeater to that, and I'm loading in all that data. Okay. So right now, the way it's set up is Sitefinity is going to cache that, and there's a very high chance that I may not see new users if they're being added during my browsing experience. To make something so that it always pulls from live and it isn't being cached, we're going to open up this cache substitution region. And actually, let's go ahead and comment out this code here. Let's comment this code, and we're going to talk through this. Okay, so there's really three methods that I have set up. Render cache substitution markup and render or do post cache substitution. These are just two custom methods. The naming doesn't really matter here. And then I'm overriding the render contents method. Okay, so this is always going to run. And if we come down to do post cache substitution, we are using our cache substitution wrapper. And this is a Sitefinity class here. Okay, and what we're doing with this is we're passing in parameters. I'm not having any parameters specifically into this. This would be a good place to throw labels into it, or if, in my case, I'm actually doing a repeater. So everything's coming directly from my data source. But if I have any static labels or anything, I'm going to populate those into my parameters and pass those into this method. And this is going to do this render markup delegate. I'm going to pass in my method that gets run whenever it's going to render the markup. And you'll see we have this register post cache callback. So this essentially gets ran after initialize has already happened, after the cached page has already been pulled. It's going to actually run this method right here, and it's going to render out that code. And I have to do it by hand. So again, this isn't using our layout template path anymore. We are actually rendering out the HTML manually using a string builder. Okay. So with this, we have our parameters that we passed in. I'm grabbing my user manager. I'm getting the users. Same code for the first three lines here. And now I'm creating a string builder. I'm creating my UL. So this is what I have in my header template. And then for each user, I'm actually rendering out the string here. So I'm creating that string, and then I return it from the render cache substitution markup. And this is going to run instead of anything from my initialized controls running. So we're actually going to build this to verify it still works. So essentially, override render contents, register your post cache callback, and make sure you populate your method that actually does the rendering. And then in your rendering, you're going to create a string object of all of your HTML code. Okay. Build succeeded. Let's go ahead and jump back to our page, and we should see pretty much the same thing. Okay, I'll just wait for the build here, and actually let's look at the questions list. Has there been any more work? And actually, it looks like we had a couple questions about this cache substitution, specifically around MVC. I am not as wired in as some of the other guys are with the MVC stuff going on, but what I will do is I will take note of that, and we will follow up on that in the blog post. This might actually be something that the Feather guys can comment on. Okay. All right, our page is rendering. We have the same output that we had before, and if we actually come in and do a debug, and actually that's one more thing I'm going to go ahead and point out just for the developers in the line real quick. I am using it's Trevor. It's a Visual Studio X extension. It essentially just makes the process of going into debug, attach the process, and selecting W3 WP exe much quicker. It automatically attaches that process for me. And on that same note, when you're doing your development and you're doing your testing, I do not recommend using the Visual Studio Debugger if you can. It'll be a little slow. If you can actually create an IIS website and point directly to your project folder and then use the attach to process to do your debugging, you're going to be able to debug a lot faster, and your site actually is going to run a lot faster under IIS instead of IIS Express. Okay. So let's come back to our page here. If we do a refresh, so even though the page is being cached, we're still getting this code here being executed, and page renders. Okay. So this is how you do cache substitution. It's going to be beneficial in a lot of circumstances. If you have your own custom Twitter widget, if you're pulling from your own third-party feed of data that you want to make sure is always live, if you Twitter feed's a pretty common example of that as well. Obviously, if you can, go ahead and do your actual pulling of the data using JavaScript and web services, because then you know that that content's being fetched each time because it's not being done in the code behind itself. So if you can, use JavaScript client-side code, connect to the services to do that. Otherwise, make sure you do cache substitution on those widgets. Okay. Let me just review real quick. I think we've covered just about everything. So we've talked about the page templates. We've talked about what to check into source control, the setup, so switching to .NET 4.5 using the NuGet packages. We've talked about the app data folder, the proper setup for your master pages and page templates. Talked about using custom layout widgets over using custom widgets in Sitefinity, how much time you can save there, as well as how to customize the out-of-the-box widgets that don't support widget templates using that view map. So that ends the webinar. We can go ahead and take some questions now. So I'm going to start scrolling through some of the questions here and answer the ones I can. I probably won't be able to get to all of them, but we will follow up with a blog post to answer the ones that don't get answered today. Okay, so we have, is there a way to do a configuration transform like web config on the Sitefinity configuration? The answer to this is yes. You can still shoot transforms. I believe the tool that we've used in the past for this is called Slow Cheetah. I personally have not used this in a while, but my understanding is it does XML transformations, and it would allow you to have like a development production version of those config files. You would have to configure this to actually work, but this is a tool that handles that. Is there a better way to create new widgets in a separate assembly instead of the Sitefinity web app project? Yes. So let's talk about that. I have my webinar.sitefinity project here. This is actually an important setup thing to mention. I do not recommend coming into the Sitefinity web app project, adding another folder, and creating like a widgets folder to host all your widgets. Okay, it'll certainly work, but I always recommend creating an external project to host all of that code. And really the only thing that you're going to have in the Sitefinity web app project that'll be custom is going to be your app data Sitefinity, which is your config, your website templates, your JavaScript, your layout, widget templates, everything. Okay? And then you'll probably have some customizations to MVC if you're using MVC, and then the global.asax file, which I'm not using here, but that's essentially where you can register a lot of startup code. For your custom widgets, I recommend creating those in a separate project, custom modules as well. So you can just create another project in the solution, and then what I did is you can see I have references here. You can just point these references. So let's do add reference. And instead of setting up NuGet packages on the webinar.sitefinity project itself, you can just refer them to the root. So let's come browse, and we have webinar project packages. You can just come in here and actually point your references directly to those packages, because those will be checked into source control. Okay. So we can just come in and do telerik.sitefinity.core and select our libraries here. Thunder will also handle creating widgets in there. So if I actually right-click on the project and do add new item, you can see that I can actually create these widgets right here, and Thunder will take care of doing it in the separate project, as long as you have the references created. So we got a question around continuous integration and whether or not I have this hooked up with this project. I do not. Right now, I just have source control. I'm actually using Get right now for this. We don't have any CI hooked up, but if you guys are attending Telerik Next, that session or that conference is being in May, hosted in May. I think it's the 3rd to the 5th, and there are sessions, and I will actually be co-presenting on that session for continuous delivery within Sitefinity, and that will cover everything from continuous integration with source control and having automated builds occur, as well as doing testing, so automated testing and automated deployment. So it'll do the automated builds, automated testing, automated deployment as part of the whole process, and that will be a session we'll be covering at Telerik Next if you can attend for that. Regarding the compile times for Sitefinity, the best thing you can do is to make sure that you have the latest version of Visual Studio. Obviously, that's going to help. Aside from that, it's going to be hardware. So if you can increase your processor speed, solid-state drive always helps. On this specific machine, I'm using a solid-state drive, and I've got some kind of quad-core processor in here. I'm not specifically sure which one, but those are going to be the two main areas where you can increase the performance of builds. Okay. And I do not know if we will be doing recordings of the Telerik Next sessions, just because those sessions are essentially for paid attendees of the conference. That would be a question that maybe you can post to the contact page on the Telerik Next. I'm not sure on that one. Okay. The remainder of the questions we will follow up afterwards with a blog post. Again, I thank everyone for attending. I hope this was very valuable. Enjoy the rest of your day.